entrepreneurial success in thousands of people in Silicon Valley. I was working with a man, Adeo Resi, who ran an institute called the Founder Institute, which was the biggest early stage tech incubator in the world. I think he started 5,000 companies, something like that. And we can predict entrepreneurial ability pretty well, basically with general cognitive ability, trait openness, and a bit of a positive tilt for age. But this is what was happening in his classes. He'd get 50 people together at a very early stage in the development of their business ideas. And now and then he'd get a couple of bad apples in the group, and that would just destroy the class. And then he was spending all his time attending to the troublemakers. So he came back to us and he said, look, we're doing a pretty good job of finding people who are qualified, but we can't keep out the troublemakers. And I thought, well, could we do that psychometrically? So this might be something interesting to consider in relationship to the dark triad and the personality disorders. So, there is a central factor in personality disorders. If you turn the personality disorder items in the DSM into questionnaire items, you can extract out a single factor. And one of the best predictors of failure to respond to clinical intervention on the personality disorder side is sheer number of personality disorder symptoms. So it's kind of just like a severity index, So what we did was we turned the DSM personality disorder items into questions, and then we administered them to a very large number of people. And then we pulled out a central factor. And then we found the items in the personality disorder questionnaire that best predicted the central tendency and those that predicted it the least. And then we forced people to choose between them. They both sound bad, eh? They both sound like pathological attributes. But one is much more clearly a marker of the central proclivity than the other. And then we did the same thing with Wink's narcissism scale. And so then we were able to identify people who had this narcissistic proclivity and a personality disorder proclivity, and we'd screen those people out if they scored more than 95th percentile. And that cut the incidence of troublemaking in the classes dramatically. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because it'd be very interesting to see, and maybe you guys have already done this, and so this is also a question on that front, is like a lot of the personality disorder symptoms look to me like they're manifestations of the more severe end of the dark tetrad traits. And it would be lovely to see this psychometric enterprise enter the domain of psychopathological prediction, and maybe the doorway through that is the honesty, humility dimension, differentiated out into the more antisocial pathologies in the manner that you've done it. It sounds like that's an interesting bridge into the technically clinical world.
Well, that's been a dynamic in the development of our understanding of the link between normal and clinical traits. I don't want to step on the toes of clinicians, but I understand the movement toward trying to make all clinical disorders dimensional. And that's been a real clash between the traditional clinicians who feel that you've got schizophrenia or you don't got schizophrenia, as opposed to having a dimension that represents a particular disorder and placing people on it. And so I understand why some clinicians who are have a psychometric proclivity are a little bit offended at me trying to come up with labels that sound like clinical disorders but aren't really, because all of the people I study are doing okay. And you alluded to this earlier, but there's very little maladjustment among any of those four dark personalities. You can't get them to correlate very strongly with, especially with the general neuroticism or feeling of distress. They're not distressed. Whether they're high or low, there's very little relation there.
Right. That's an interesting case of the absence of distress being a marker for pathology, because that is the problem with being a psychopath in some real sense, is you do impulsive things and they hurt you in the long run. which is why you end up in prison or with no friends or as a catastrophic failure by the age of 40. But none of that's being marked by psychological distress along the way. So you're opaque to the trouble that your own pathology is causing, and that means you're not getting error signals when you should. So you're not depressed or anxious, but you're also whistling in the dark as you walk towards a cliff. So not helpful.
Yeah, a very clever study that you outlined there. Sometimes one gets a sample or an opportunity to study a certain group, and that's what carries one's research. But if you think about it, that's been a difficulty in doing dark side research. You've got to validate these measures, so you've got to have hard criteria, especially behavior. You can rely on the judgments of others to some extent, but hard, visible, recordable behavior is really the most persuasive kind of criterion. But think about sadism. How are you going to show that in the laboratory? That was a real challenge to us, but in a way it was fun, developing measures that can be used, can get by these very restrictive IRB boards that look through your work and say, no, you can't do that, you can't do this. And so we came up with this notion of bug killing, which I guess I have to attribute that to Dan Jones, who came up with the notion of getting people to think that they're crunching bugs in a coffee grinder. And again, such variance. Some people loved it. We tried to anthropomorphize the bugs by giving them names. So there was a little wee container that had names like Ike and Muffin, cute little names, but they had to take these bugs, put them into the cruncher, press down and hear what sounded like bug parts flying apart. It was actually just coffee beans. But again, like the Milgram study, they thought they were doing it. And when some of the subjects say, hey, got any more? That was fun. Other people were so horrified to think about the whole idea, they just ran out of the lab when we described what we wanted them to do. Lovely to have variance like that when you're studying something sensitive like sadism. We also use voodoo dolls. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that research. Giving subjects a cute little doll and saying, think of the person that you really dislike. Now we're going to leave you alone for 5 minutes.